You're listening to the LA Football Podcast.
Hey, what's going on, Los Angeles? Happy day 2 of NFL Draft Day. Welcome to the LA Football Show here on the LA Football Network. We are live on the Mightier 1090 ESPN Radio, talking all things Rams, Chargers draft. Going to sprinkle in some USC and some UCLA if there's time, because there's still plenty to talk about with those teams. Obviously, Jordan Addison getting drafted yesterday from SC, some transfers coming in. But the big topics right now are the Chargers, who drafted yesterday at pick 21, Quentin Johnston out of TCU, excuse me. So we will talk extensively about that for podcasts. This will be your Chargers portion throughout right now. And then we'll get after that into some Rams talk. They got plenty of picks coming up here. They're sitting at 36 with a lot of great players on the board, Jamal. So excited to get into that. But first, my friend Jamal Madni, co-host, how we doing? Happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday, Rye. Excited to talk about the draft here. I mean, it was a really fun evening last night. I know you and I were both sort of involved in various draft activities. I was actually down in Century City, the Century City Mall, and got to enjoy the Chargers draft party. Really a fun environment out there in the heart of Century City Mall, just at that courtyard. Tons of folks out there, a couple hundred, and Brandon Staley was there signing autographs and addressed the crowd after the Quentin Johnston pick, and just a really fun atmosphere. A lot of, music, food, just really felt like a really nice community out there.
That's awesome. I know you sent me pictures, and I'm glad you got to go there. I want to hear more about it, and if we have time, we'll get into the pick first, so we make sure we hit that. But I'd love to hear a little more about it for those that weren't there, because that's sweet that Staley was. It kind of reminds you of the Draft Day movie, when after their pick, they're all on stage and exactly. We had a great day, and they talk about it. So I'd love to hear more about it. But I was down with our guy, Jake Hefner. He does an annual draft party at his place. Obviously, he's the Chargers Unleashed co-host, for those that don't know. So it was me, Danny Dubs, Skinny T, Dirty Chai Decker made a guest appearance, 5 picks in. So it was a good time hanging out, and we did a little pre-draft show. So, but yeah, I mean, well, real quickly before we get into it, show is always brought to you by our friends at BetOnline. Head to betonline.ag today. Plenty to bet on the draft today. If anyone put money on the Chargers taking Quentin Johnston, you came out probably with a pretty penny, because I don't know if he was mocked by anyone. And so the odds were probably pretty high. And so head to betonline.ag today. You can bet on the Chargers' next couple picks on what they can do, and see if you can win yourself some money. Those are tough odds, but if not, you got the Lakers playing tonight. You got the Kings, you got Dodgers, you got all the stuff in action. So betonline.ag. Promo code BELIEVE gets you a 50% welcome bonus. Tell them the guys over at the LA Football Network sent you. So, well, Jamal, let's get into it. Pick 21. The board honestly couldn't have fallen any better for the Chargers based on everything we've talked about pre-draft. You had all the tight ends on the board. You had some great defenders in Brian Branch, who we mocked in our last mock just 2 days ago. You had Nolan Smith, premium edge rusher out of Georgia, who kind of fell that far. It felt throughout this process that, I know you personally were leaning tight end. I was leaning more defense, but it felt just in circles that you heard, the Chargers were always leaning wide receiver at some point. We love Jordan Addison, Zay Flowers was the talk. Not a lot of talk about Quentin Johnston. That's the pick they go with. So before I'll give my opinion, but just your thought right off the bat on when that pick came through, and then we'll get into, now that it's settled, our true thoughts. But just when the pick came through, what went through your mind?
Yes, I mean, shock and surprise, Ryan, just because it just wasn't a name we were considering in that particular spot for all the reasons that you talked about. I mean, I think, so much of the conversation was around Smith-Njigba and Addison and Flowers at receiver. And then so much of the conversation was around Kincaid and Mayer at tight end. And then we were talking about these premium edge rushers, and the expectation being that they would be taken much, much higher. And obviously a Will McDonald was, but didn't think Nolan Smith was available. Didn't think Brian Branch, for all of his abilities and compliment to Derwin James, would be available. And it was interesting also, a couple hours before the draft, Derwin James's quote really kind of spread around the news around, I really want a dog with that 21st pick. I don't want any puppies. I want a dog. And so You were wondering, with that sort of insinuation, do the Chargers go defense, with that 21 pick? And so a lot of intrigue. And I think that there was sort of an optionality that they had presented to them with this pick. And I think there was probably a top 2 or 3 players with each option. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, Quentin Johnston wasn't really a top 3 guy at the wide receiver option. So just for that reason, in just that sort of premeditated kind of thinking and research and homework, it certainly was a surprise.
Yeah. Just starting with that, I agree. We were, we're in Jake's house, all excited. We're done with our work now. Now it's time to enjoy. And like, okay, what's going to happen with this pick? There's a high anticipation in the room, about 15 to 20 people there. And just silence when the pick came in because of the board that I just listed, all the options there. And so the initial thought, and this is what makes, the draft so exciting because, we can all sit here and pretend like or not pretend, but like we like to think we know exactly what we're talking about in predictions and whatnot, but we'll really have no idea till, 2-3 years down the line. But based on all the homework everyone's done, all the research everyone done, all the mock drafts, just no one had this as a pick. And it would have been, there was a lot of names that maybe weren't as desired, but would have been less surprising had the name came across on the screen. So the initial thought was kind of shock just with everyone but Smith and Jigma as receiver available, all the tight ends available, some premium edge rushers available, some premium secondary guys available. And so they went with the position I think we kind of thought they would go with, just maybe not the player. Now, before I toss it back to you, after digesting it and scooting back a little bit and letting the shock leave, I don't necessarily, and you know me, I'm always a kind of a glass half full guy, but I don't necessarily dislike the pick now looking at it from a larger lens and context and kind of seeing what they were seeing. And the thing I always think about, and this is just one play, but in the playoff game against Michigan and TCU, Max Duggan throws a short little 7-yard dig route that Johnston takes 75 to the house, burning the corner who runs a 4.36 40, and he burns him and goes 75 yards to the house. So a guy of his size, 6'3" pedigree, 210. I know he only ran like a 4.49 or so, 40 somewhere in there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that tells all the tale. I think he is a fast guy that they'll get. And to really compare, because I saw a lot of people saying like, oh, they're just getting a second Mike Williams. I do think he's a better route runner. He is faster than Mike Williams. And I think when you look at the context of the offense, Jordan Addison, who we both love, and we both, I think, agreed that had they picked Jordan Addison, that kind of signified the end of Keenan Allen in a way. Whereas now with this pick, you have Keenan Allen that can be your true slot guy. You have Mike Williams and Quentin Johnston, who can be both your X and Y on the outside. And then Josh Palmer can kind of slot in whenever they want to do things. So I think as I look back further, and you can totally disagree, but I think it does make more sense in terms of fit than maybe a Zay Flowers or Jordan Addison ever actually did for this season. Now, the future's a different story, but for this season, if they're going all in, trying to win the Super Bowl now, as they should be with this roster, it does make a little more sense for me, and I do like the pick.
Yeah, Ryan, I'm not surprised to hear you put the glass half full, and it's a nice spin. It's a nice story. The reality is this was a terrible pick. And I think it was evidenced also, Ryan, here in Century City, there was sort of it was BP and then it was AP. Before the pick, the party was popping, a couple hundred people there, the music was flowing. After that pick, Ryan, Century City was like a library, and people were filing out 5-7 minutes after that pick, had absolutely no idea what to think of it, and the place sort of emptied out pretty quickly. I hear you, Ryan. I certainly agree in terms of his explosive element, in terms of Quentin Johnston. You mentioned that play. It was a little, sideline, 6-yard little out route that he took to 75 in that up and down game with Michigan. Look, he averaged 22.1 yards per catch in the Big 12. He's a 2-time all Big 12 player in a very wide open conference with a lot of big plays. And he was certainly at the top of that list in terms of athlete as well as production. So completely understand it there. But when you look at how he fared in the national championship game against Georgia, he got absolutely manhandled by that Georgia secondary of NFL players. And in that sort of debacle of a game, it certainly wasn't his fault and it wasn't Duggan's fault. They were just overmatched. But in his individual matchups against Georgia in that title game, he got completely manhandled. And so there's no evidence on film to me against elite competition that he's ready to play at the next level as an extremely productive player. And then when you factor in the opportunity to get an Addison, Smith-Njigba, and one of these tight ends who truthfully would be better fits in that offense, particularly the tight end, given how much, Kellen Moore loves the tight end in terms of his system. And then a guy like Smith-Njigba and Addison, you can just do so much with those guys. You can, line them up out wide. You can put them in the slot. You can do bunch formations with them. There's just so much more versatility than necessarily with the Quentin Johnston. I almost think the Chargers panicked, to be honest with you, where they didn't realize the optionality that was presented in front of them. I don't think they really planned out to have this much variety at that pick. And I think it felt to me like there was just sort of panic and chaos in that war room. And they just completely panicked and sort of went with a guy that, they thought maybe would be sort of the best of all worlds, but it's sort of the average of all these things that they really want. And they end up kind of in no man's land. And so I get it. But, if you ask me, the Mike Williams successor, where is that on the list of Chargers needs going into next year? That would be a pretty low list. And when you look at the size, when you look at the catch radius, when you look at where they have thrived mostly in terms of production, tremendous amount of overlap. Now, Johnston has another gear, to your point, that Williams doesn't have, and he may be a cleaner route runner in college. We'll see if that translates to the pro level. But that's so nuanced in terms of variation, Ryan, that this was not the move to make here. And it really makes you wonder how serious to take the Chargers as a viable contender year in and year out when you make decisions like this at 21.
So for you, the pick, I'm assuming, still would have been Michael Mayer, seeing as he was available.
For me, given that he was on the board, it would have been Mayer or it would have been Smith-Njigba, truthfully. I mean,
Smith-Njigba was gone.
Smith-Njigba was gone right before. So it was Mayer or Addison.
Yeah. If they took Johnston over Smith-Njigba, then I would have been very upset. Still, I would have taken Addison before because I agree with you there. But for me, it was either Nolan Smith or Brian Branch. Those were the two that I'm shocked they were both there. And Brian Branch still there. Brian Branch going into the second round and, could be there for the Rams, which we'll talk about later. But that for me, seeing those two guys would have been.
I mean, Ryan, did anyone do better than the Eagles last night? I mean, holy cow. I mean, when you talk about Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, when all is said and done, Ryan, those might be the two best players in the draft when all is said and done. I mean, Carter was absolutely number one on Mel Kiper's big board, even with the quarterbacks, even with Young, even with Stroud and everybody else. Obviously, the big red flag that still needs to play itself out is his character, his behavior, his background, and some of those things. So I can understand why teams, when you're putting that level of investment at that high a pick, you would be concerned about that and maybe step away. Having said that, he's an absolute steal at 9, I believe it was, with where the Eagles kind of traded up to get him. And then when you factor in that with Nolan Smith on the back end, and Nolan Smith might be the best pure athlete in the draft. When you talk about his explosiveness, his ability to close out, and you put those two together with the defense that was already quite good and at the top of the NFL, the Eagles are setting themselves up very nicely to be the NFC favorites yet again. And then I think the Bills did an absolutely outstanding job in getting Dalton Kincaid for exactly what they needed. I think Kincaid is a better fit for Josh Allen than Mayer would have been. And now you get him with, Josh Allen and all those other great weapons that they have. I think those two teams really stood out to me as big winners.
Yeah, for sure. Last thing about other teams, then we'll get back to the Chargers and wrap up with maybe a quick outlook on rounds 2 and 3, since that's coming up here in just a few hours. But what were your thoughts on the Lions? The Lions is one of those, take Jahmyr Gibbs, take Jack Campbell, the second best Jack Campbell since Nicolas Cage starred in the movie Family Man. and out of Iowa. But it's one of those. Here's what I've come to learn with the draft, and this could be said about the Chargers' first pick. After the draft, our job is to analyze the picks based on what we know going into the draft. So we can say, based on what we know, the Lions probably had a pretty poor showing here in taking Gibbs maybe a little higher than they should have, taking Campbell, who was arguably a second or third round, especially in the way linebackers are valued. They took two positions of very low value, very high in the first round. But, then you do that as your analysis, but then you look back and say, okay, are these guys that truly they see as perfect fits for them? And, we'll never know until years down the line. And maybe this is being just too nice and too coy. But a guy like, their scouting department and Dan Campbell and have seemingly seen a lot of top tier talent come through and do different things. Being Brad Holmes, that is, who was with the Rams for many years. Maybe it's, it's one of those where it was just everyone missed something. I'm not saying we did, but just what's your thoughts on the Lions draft? Because they were definitely the most scrutinized as having a horrible day one.
I was actually on the other side. I actually think Gibbs might be the steal of the whole draft. And I think that when you look at what he brings to the table, I get it with running back and commoditized position. But again, I mean, it was so ironic. We were talking about Gibbs earlier in the week with Danny Dub and sort of making that comparison to Alvin Kamara with kind of the Reggie Bush feet and his ability to cut that way. And when you look at what the Lions were kind of missing, look, they've got a plethora of young receivers that are very good. So they weren't necessarily looking for receiver in the same way as some other teams were in that position. I think they needed another weapon from another dimension of the field on offense to really kind of take that team to the next level. I think where Jared Goff was successful in the Sean McVay scheme was purely off of play action when Todd Gurley was Todd Gurley. And Gurley could sort of hammer you down. Gurley could be explosive out of the backfield and could receive. And I think Gibbs is in many ways brings a skill set very similar to a prime Todd Gurley. And so I think that's really what the Lions were seeing in the sense of how do we make Goff as successful as possible to now take that next step. Now that Aaron Rodgers is out of the division, we really are much closer to winning this division and being consistently winning this division and being a perennial playoff team. So it sort of changes your outlook a little bit. Now, the Campbell move, that was very questionable at best. Makes the Quentin Johnston move look genius. But, the Gibbs move, I didn't mind it. And I thought that sometimes, Ryan, and you and I have sort of talked about this, when you are getting the player you want, whether that player is going to be around in another 20 or 25 picks or not, sometimes you just go with what you want. And I think Gibbs is what the Lions wanted, irrespective of where they pick. And so I commend them for that part of it. Now, I think Campbell, there was, again, so many other players on the board, Nolan Smith, others that could have really helped them on the other side of the ball. But the Gibbs move, I didn't mind it.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to ask you, because I think that's what's so beautiful about the draft is there's so many different perspectives on who won, who didn't, how to grade a player, how they fit. And we'll talk second and third round for the Chargers after the break. So we'll wrap up with this quickly. But because when you look at the Lions, and I think Gibbs, they agree with you. I think that was their guy. They saw a fit. But when you look at from the outside, like if we're looking at the Chargers and Quentin Johnston and does he fit or is he too similar to Williams? I mean, the Lions just got David Montgomery in the offseason. They have DeAndre Swift. So, I mean, they have like young backs and then they drafted another back. So now they have three very viable backs. One they just paid in Montgomery. But obviously they see something in Gibbs that either brings something that those two don't have or that they're going to replace one of them down the line. And so you can look at that same context of like, well, maybe Quentin Johnston, and we have no idea, was the Chargers guy all along. They just saw a better fit with him than others. We can agree, disagree. But just looking at it from that perspective, when you look at other teams and seeing how some people thought it was a horrible pick, makes no sense because of who they have on the rosters. Others like yourself say, you know what? I think he's a great value. He can do things differently. He can be a gadget guy. He can play in the slot if need be. He did a lot of pass catching for Alabama. And so it's just basically all I'm doing is telling everyone out there to have that open mind in these draft picks and wait a year or two. But at the same time, we have to sit here and analyze them because otherwise, what the hell are we even doing if we're not going to give grades or not?
Right. I love the fact that it was a bad pick. Like, let's keep it real. It was a bad pick when you're spending 2 minutes on our opening segment telling our fans to keep an open mind. That doesn't happen. when you get your guy. So it's there's no doubt about it that this was not a good pick for the Chargers. And I think that where they sort of came about it is, I think that they panicked, number one. I think they looked to Kellen Moore in the war room, and Johnston reminded them the most of CeeDee Lamb. And I think that they tried to kind of recreate what Moore had in Dallas to sort of make this thing as seamless as possible. And they're hoping that Johnston becomes the Chargers' future and their version of CeeDee Lamb. And obviously CeeDee has been so phenomenal the last couple of years, and hoping that lightning strikes again.
Yeah, we shall see. It'd certainly be a long topic of discussion, all these long 2 months of offseason before training camp starts. But the Chargers are going to be on the clock again here soon. So at the next break, we'll talk some Chargers, what they can do in the second round. Then we'll transition over to Rams. Keep it right here. This is the LA Football Show. Talk to you here in just a minute. Hey, Los Angeles, welcome back to the LA Football Show here on the LA Football Network, live on the Mightier 1090 ESPN Radio. This is your continued Chargers coverage, day 2 now of the NFL Draft, sitting with picks 54 in the second round and 85 in the third round. Those are the total numbers, 23 in the second, 22 in the third, and we can talk a little bit about what expectations are after taking Quentin Johnston in the first round, wide receiver out of TCU. Show is always brought to you by our friends at BetOnline, betonline.ag, promo code BELIEVE, 50% welcome bonus. You can bet on the second and third round if you head there right now. Tell them the guys the LA Football Network sent you. So, Jamal, let's just keep it rolling. Chargers talk. Had a lot of great conversation about Quentin Johnston at the first segment, and now we'll get into maybe some expectations because the board fell very nicely. There was a lot of great positional players, whether it was tight end, whether it was safety, whether it was defensive line for the Chargers. They went with wide receiver like many kind of thought. Now with that 54 in the second round, I'll just put you on the spot. We don't have to give player names yet, but what kind of position do you hope they kind of target now at 54?
Ryan, I think now it's about defense. So for me, it's looking at either interior defensive lineman, edge, or secondary. So I'm sort of looking at, those three positions as where the Chargers need to be thinking. And I think where things have fallen in terms of the first day of the draft, I think there's going to be some really intriguing possibilities there.
So let me ask you this. Just throwing some names out. These guys could go way earlier, but I'm going to give you 3 names, and you tell me who you would go. And one of them is not defense, but we're just going to spice it up and keep it interesting because this is the LA Football Show. So if you have a BJ Ojulari there, edge out of LSU, I think there's a lot of good tape on him, a lot of good hype on him. Or Clark Phillips, corner out of Utah, guy wreaked havoc in the Pac-12, specifically against our LA teams. Or running back Zach Charbonnet, sitting there at 54. Those 3 guys, what direction are you going?
Wow. It's going to be interesting. I think a lot of this is also predicated on how the Chargers feel about J.C. Jackson and his rehabilitation moving forward. And I think that they've come out and made some really strong, encouraging statements about J.C. going to be completely ready for the season. He's already about 75% of the way there, and he's going to make himself back to the player that he was. And so how committed are they to that timeline, to that narrative, and to just the validity of those statements from a medical perspective? Because it's one thing for JC to come back on time, and then it's another thing for JC Jackson, the all-pro, to come back on time. And so I think only they know the answer to that question. But I would say if they have full confidence, or at least greater than 90% confidence, that the J.C. Jackson that they paid for last year is going to be that guy, and he's got more years in him, and he's going to completely make a recovery here, then I would go Ojulari from LSU. I think that's the position of need. We've talked about this a bunch. Compliment Bosa. Bosa's had some durability issues the last few years. Mac is starting to get longer in the tooth in terms of the thing that he's very good at. Let's fortify that. Let's get the Chargers the dog that Derwin James wants and not the puppy. That makes all the sense in the world. As much as I love Zach Charbonnet, now I feel like the Chargers have to get hyper-focused if they were a little squishy at 21, where, Johnston might work out, he might not. It's not the sure thing that maybe we thought they would get at 21 or what we were hoping for. Now you have to really lock in and be super focused. So I would go Ojulari, then Clark Phillips, and pains me to say this, then Charbonnet. I know I have wanted Charbonnet on one of these LA teams, but between Eckler is going to come back, and between what you have with Kelly and the others, I don't know if that is sort of the need now, in terms of in that hyper-focused way to really improve your team. Because what I'm worried about is if they just go Charbonnet and they say, okay, Kellen Moore, here's a couple of tools, make one of them work, then all that has really happened is they've added just one offensive piece to this core when, the defense was inconsistent for a large part of that season last year. And that has the greatest potential in terms of upside improvement year over year when you go into the draft. So for that reason, I would go Ojulari, then Phillips, then Charbonnet.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with you. And it does pain me to say, because obviously everyone knows our love for Charbonnet, and I think we both agree that he's going to be a steal in this draft, whoever does get him. Bijan Robinson and Gibbs obviously went in the first. I would presume Charbonnet will be the next back taken, whether that's early second, late second, or early third. You might get a guy sneak in there. It seems like a running back always they fall very differently than what the public persona is. But I agree with you that the need and the luxury outweighs it, or the need outweighs the luxury, if you will, in terms of depth at edge. And, Danny Dubb, when we did our mock draft a few days ago, brought up a really good point. I think Charbonnet is a better talent and has a higher ceiling, but Isaiah Spiller is a very similar style runner already on the roster. And only 1 year in, it'd be one thing if this was like his third season and we haven't seen enough, but was really not used at all last year, whether that was a Joe Lombardi situation or whether that was him not learning the playbook, whatever it may be. Now he's going to go into year 2. Yes, it's a new system, but he's more mature. He's been with this organization now for a full season and, now going into his second off season. And so I think that for that reason, having Eckler back, having Joshua Kelly, who's now kind of the true kind of veteran, and then having Isaiah Spiller, who can be almost your rookie running back, if you will, there's no sense to add another one. Ojulari, I agree, just, would bring so much versatility at that edge position that is a good edge group, but not a deep edge group. And if you can have NASCAR packages with the likes of Mack, Bosa, and Ojulari, you still got Chris Rump developing. If they bring back Kyle Van Noy after the draft, now you have not only two of the best premier edge rushers, but you have two of the best or three of the best then in terms of depth, because we know this team's going to get injured. It always does. It's the NFL. Someone's going to go down at some point, and so you want to have that. So I agree with you. I think Ojulari, if he's available, makes a ton of sense for them to go in that spot. And if he's not, I still think defensive line is probably the pick of choice over even a secondary, unless it's a guy like a Brian Branch falls all the way to 54 or one of these premier corners. Then it'd be kind of hard to say no.
You're absolutely right. And so, but it's the Chargers. And at this point, chargering it has become a draft concept now. I mean, who knows what they're going to pick here, at the rate that they're going. I hope that they've regrouped and had a nice night of sleep. And I think the one benefit that they have going into day 2 is they're so early in day 2, relative to sort of the day itself. Hopefully they've been able to kind of plan some things out now and, be in a position where they have more clarity, because that pick just did not feel like clarity. Look, he may turn out, and I just want to touch on Johnstone for a second here, Ryan. He may turn out to be a great player, and I hope he will, for his sake, for the Chargers' sake, for everybody's sake. You're always rooting for these kids to do really well. But where I'm concerned is strategic clarity with the Chargers. When you sort of have this guy pop up a little bit out of nowhere, you wonder a little bit, do they have the right horses in the stable from a management standpoint, a strategy standpoint, to really take this team to truly the next level? Or are they just going to be a team of circumstance where things are either going to have to fall into their lap, they're going to have to kind of do things accidentally, they're going to have to rely on other teams and their star players being injured to make a run in the AFC? That's, to me, the bigger takeaway. Not so much about Johnstone, the player, and what he can do, but sort of what went into the decision-making process. Because It is that decision-making process, time over time, that separates the elite organizations from the great ones, and the great ones from the good ones, and the good ones from the bad ones. And so that, this is not kind of the little engine that could Chargers anymore. Not when you have a franchise quarterback of the type of Justin Herbert there for the next 10 years. You have to start thinking bigger. You have to start thinking more clearly, and you have to be more forward leaning in terms of your thinking. And so I worry a little bit. My confidence level in Telesco right now is a little low. And so he has an opportunity to kind of regain some of that here today and tomorrow. So let's see what he does.
So two questions for you. I pulled up a little mock draft just so we could have some names to throw out. So I took Ojulari like we will decided. And so I'll give you some names at that third pick and then we can move on. But before that, and this will kind of lead into that, can you see a world, teams do this all the time. The Chargers have done it before, not this early necessarily, but even with taking Johnston in the first round, can you see a world where they take another receiver in this draft? There's some notable names in this third round potentially that are different style players than Johnston, add that speed level. I'm not saying that'd be the right pick, but can you see a world where they do that?
I could. I don't agree with it, but I could. And I think, if that's sort of the approach to say our goal is to give Kellen Moore every opportunity to have a top 3 offense. And at the end of the day, the NFL is an offensive-driven league. You and I, Ryan, have talked about this. The Eagles were the number 1 defense in the NFL, and they got torched by 38 points in the Super Bowl and lost. So how much can defense really take you to begin with? And granted, you need depth and you need guys back there to sort of handle the injury situations. But at the end of the day, if you're not putting 30 to 35 points a game in this modern NFL, it really doesn't matter who your defense is. And the gap between a B-plus defense and a C-plus defense is actually so in the margins that you might as well just double down on offense. Now, again, I don't agree with that thinking, but at least I can sort of understand the logical thread there. So it wouldn't shock me if they went another receiver, in the second or third round, if there was a guy that they really liked that they thought there was tremendous outsized value for the draft position that they were in at that time.
So perfect. And I agree. I don't necessarily love if they would do that, but I definitely can see a world where they would do that. And other teams certainly have as well. So, and they, come into this draft not super heavy at receiver anyway, re-signed Jalen Guyton, but I believe they only had 4 or 5 on the roster coming into this draft, now 5 or 6 with Johnston. So, okay. So I'm going to give you a few names here sitting at 85. So based on potential, another receiver, Tank Dell or Marvin Mims potentially could both still be available there at 85. Or you go back to corner now because they went edge with their second round pick. Tre'Vius Hodges-Tomlinson out of TCU, teammate of Johnston, potentially available there, which we both like him a lot as a prospect and a corner that could add to this, whether J.C. Jackson's back or not. You just add more depth. Or Tajay Spears, running back, and add more depth to the running back room. So more offense heavy in this third round.
I love it. Oh, man. Ryan bringing the heat here today with the optionality. I love that. I love Tomlinson. And so I think that for me, that would sort of then be the pick because to our earlier point about what kind of JC Jackson are you going to get, it's a little bit of an insurance policy a little later in the draft. Then, you're not using your number 2 on a corner. You're using your number 3. I think that would be where I would go with the pick. And then if I'm sort of doubling down on what, to make Kellen Moore most successful, I love Tank Dell's speed. Mims is a steal. I might go Tajay Spears over those guys because I think that the complement then, we talked a lot about Isaiah Spiller and the overlap with Zach Charbonnet, but when you put a Tajay Spears on the field with an Isaiah Spiller moving forward, even in a sort of a post-Austin Eckler world, now you're really starting to look like Zeke Elliott and Pollard. And it's such a perfect match there because what Tajay Spears did at Tulane, and particularly what he did against SC, if you look at that film, even the way he gets to the edge, even how quick his feet are, even just sort of the burst and sort of his instincts of where to cut and when, and also just his ability to catch out of the backfield. If you look at that Tajay Spears film, Tulane versus USC, and you look at the Pollard film, Cowboys versus Vikings last year, that's the same film. Yeah. And so when you sort of combine that with what you could get from Isaiah Spiller / Austin Eckler, and now you've got that thunder and lightning in the backfield with another toy at receiver for Johnstone, that's the guy I would go with. And so for me, Spears would really be very high on my list. I'd probably go kind of slight lean with Tomlinson just because of kind of that insurance policy. But again, it comes back to how much do I believe in J.C. Jackson? And if I still believe that J.C. Jackson is going to come back, I'm going to use Spears for that pick. I don't think I'm going to get too much more from a Dell or a Mims necessarily than what I have now in my room. But where I can really upgrade is in that thunder and lightning in the backfield.
Yeah, you said it best. I mean, a lot of it is contingent on Jackson, which, I mean, the Chargers may not even know. We think they do, but really the only person that knows is J.C. Jackson, how coming along he is. But if they feel good about it, I wouldn't even bat an eye. Spears to me would be the pick just because of everything you said. Of, this we may be seeing a last year of Eckler in a bullet uniform, and so moving forward with a Spears and a Spiller has a lot to be excited about in that backfield. And you're using a 3rd round pick on a running back, so it's not overvaluing the position like a lot of people are so worried about. Last one, just to throw a wrench at you, if Luke Schumacher's there, tight end out of Michigan, does that change your mind at all, or you feel good enough about the tight end room, even though they didn't go with one of the premier guys, to where it's either a Spears or a Tomlinson?
Yeah, Ryan, it's a great question. Again, now it's all about the delta. And for me, tight end at the 1st round made so much sense just because of how much I believed in those 2 prospects and how much they could elevate that offensive unit. I think Schumacher's a really good player, but I don't know how much more he's going to elevate that room and that offensive scheme then you get a tight end in the 6th round, or you get an undrafted tight end, or you just stick with what you have. I think that delta is very marginal versus a guy like Spears. The delta in terms of what he can do for that system, that coach, that quarterback, and given his skill set, to me, is just off the chart. So even if Schumacher's on the board, I'm going with Spears.
Yeah, I agree. It would be exciting to see him there, and missing out on Charbonnet, not really necessarily missing out, but deciding to go a different direction. And then you get a guy like Spears, who very different running back than Charbonnet, but equal in, I think, talent, just different style of talent. Would be a lot of fun for Kellen Moore and company to roll with. So let's end with this, the final couple minutes here. This is our Chargers segment before we go to break, but I think we can take these last couple minutes because Jordan Addison was such a linked prospect to the Chargers. Obviously went to SC. We covered him extensively. Would have loved to see him still in LA, and he was there for the picking. They went with Quentin Johnston. He goes 2 picks later to the Vikings, which I think is a great fit. I know similar in a sense to Justin Jefferson, a little different in how they do their routes, both phenomenal route runners, tacticians in that regard, but they do it a little bit differently. So for me, with Kevin O'Connell being the head coach in that system, I think it was a home run pick for the Vikings. Just kind of your thoughts to wrap this up on, Addison, his obviously great career in the 1 season with USC and now ending up in Minnesota with Kevin O'Connell.
Ryan, I think this was actually the best scenario for Addison. I think he should be celebrating today, and I think it's the best possible situation for him to succeed. I think it was just the best win-win scenario possible because I think he gets to step into a situation and get the tutelage from a Justin Jefferson, one of the 2, 3, 4 best receivers in all of football, learn what it takes to be completely elite, and then also bring some overlap, but also a complementary skill set in terms of kind of his route running and the things, his twitchiness and the things that he's very good at to really make defenses, when you line up both of those guys, redundancy is sort of prohibitive for an offense when the guys that are redundant only do 1 or 2 things. Redundancy is an exceptional advantage for an offense when the guys who are redundant can do a little bit of everything. So what it brings to the Vikings is a tremendous amount of versatility, and it also are wide receiver archetypes that will help Kirk Cousins in his game. He's not really an air it out. He doesn't have that Allen, Rodgers, Mahomes arm. He's much more of a tactician, reading the defenses, understands the limitations of his arm geometry, and wants to make sort of precise throws. And who better to do that than a Jordan Addison with Justin Jefferson? So I think it's a dynamic duo. Addison gets the opportunity to play more meaningfully right away, but also gets the tutelage. The Vikings get now two guys that can do a little bit of everything, that work really perfectly with Cousins. And now you've got a great coach above that whole system overseeing the touches. So win-win all around. So proud for Jordan Addison, Biletnikoff winner, such a huge piece of USC. It's always great to see a Trojan great be in a situation to be set up for success and thrive in the NFL. So a great day to celebrate for Jordan Addison fans, for Minnesota Vikings fans, and for the men of Troy and USC Trojan fans.
Yep, another USC Trojan going in the first round. Yeah, super happy for him. You couldn't have said it better, the fit with Kirk Cousins, how Addison has, I think, elusive speed, or that's not the word I'm looking for, but deceptive speed. He's faster than what his 40 time would show. I mean, just put on the tape against Stanford and how he was burning guys in that game, or put on the tape against UCLA, even had some burning situations in that. But yes, Kirk Cousins is much more of a tactician in the middle of the field and kind of closer line of scrimmage, and just having the pairing of Jefferson and Addison. I mean, that may in a year or two become one of the top wide receiver 1 and 2 in the entire NFL. And so he went to a great spot, looking fresh on draft day with the sunglasses, the shades looking all good. The hair was well kept. So congrats to Addison. Congrats to Viking fans out there. You know, we get on the Chargers, we get Eric Kendricks from you guys, former UCLA Bruin great, but played for the Vikings forever. And the Vikings get Trojan great Jordan Addison. So almost a little LA Minneapolis swap there, if you will, in a sense. So, but that's all the time we got for Chargers talk. We'll see how day 2 goes. If they follow our simulation here, I think we'll feel pretty good about it, Jamal. But quick break on radio. Chargers fans, if you're on podcast, we'll talk to you after the draft for some recaps. On radio, we'll be back at the top of the hour for Rams talk, getting into their picks coming up. Keep it right here. This is the LA Football Show.
You're listening to the LA Football Podcast.